This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
All right, great. Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here with Don Moore, who teaches at Berkeley, and he's the author of this fantastic new book called Perfectly Confident, which, of course, I wouldn't have Don on the show if I didn't heartily recommend the book, right? This podcast is really my opportunity to kind of go through my bookshelf and bring the books to life. And so I'm really glad to have you on the show. Don, welcome.
Thanks, Greg. Great to be with you.
Yeah. Now, when I knew you were writing this book, I got really excited. I didn't know exactly what to expect. And because I think you're known as the kind of guru of overconfidence, kind of the leading authority on overconfidence, I thought the book would really be about the dangers of overconfidence. But I was very pleasantly surprised when I read the galleys to see that it's really not a book about overconfidence. It's about calibration, and you kind of reveal yourself to be an Aristotelian, really, as someone who is a believer in the golden mean. And I had Barry Schwartz on the show recently, and the article that he wrote with Adam Grant was really, kind of all about, hey, we need to think about boundary conditions. We need to think about trade-offs. We need to think about the Goldilocks sweet spot for pretty much every human phenomenon that we study. And so I was really, pleased to discover that that's kind of how you organized the book. Was that always your intention?
Yeah. If you read the research literature, it's distressingly easy to come away with the mistaken impression that people are overconfident about most things most of the time, and that therefore wise decision making requires us to become less confident. But a sort of unidirectional advice like that runs the risk of making a mistake for which I take Angela Duckworth to task in my book. And that is unidirectional advice that she gives, that people should be more confident and more persistent, show greater grit in the pursuit of their goals and ambitions. And any such unidirectional advice runs the risk of sending people to an extreme that has to be an error, right? So showing more grit all the time runs the risk that you escalate your commitment to a losing course of action. You persist too long. And it's easy to think of examples like this. The inventor, the passionate inventor who's so sure that their invention is it holds tremendous commercial potential, that they make mistakes in persisting too long trying to develop the idea exactly how they conceptualized it and failing to modify or adjust to the realities of the world. Or the young athlete who devotes themselves doggedly to practicing their sport at the expense of their other studies, which are much more likely to actually result in a job than their athletic pursuits are likely to result in a career in the professional leagues. So persisting more isn't always good advice, and persisting less or being less confident isn't always good advice. A lot of my academic research tries to identify those circumstances in which people are overconfident, and there are some, and the circumstances in which people are underconfident. The conclusion that people are overconfident about everything all the time, that's not true either. So identifying when you're likely to be overconfident and moderating those erroneous beliefs, or when you're likely to be underconfident and figuring out how to buck up and be a little grittier and persisting longer in those circumstances, helps get you to the sweet spot, the Aristotelian golden mean, when you're perfectly confident.
Well, it makes you sound like an economist, right? Because every economics lecture is all about, well, they're, on the one hand, on the other hand, right? It's all about trade-offs and the Goldilocks sweet spot. But I think that type of thinking there are forces that mitigate against that kind of thinking in a couple ways. I mean, on the one hand, in order to be a successful academic or even a successful author, right, to be known and to be viral, you have to really push something hard, right? And so at most academic seminars, the easy answer, even if you're not paying attention, the easy question, even if you're not paying attention, is just to like raise your hand and say, well, what are the boundary conditions? It's like that always sets off a conversation, because most advocates try to neglect that part of the conversation. And I'd also argue that when you're speaking to a general public, and where nuance is probably a difficult thing, you probably have to think about, well, what do most people think? So if I'm giving advice on the coronavirus, like it's very hard to say, exercise the correct amount of caution, right? If I think that most people are reckless, then I'm going to kind of exaggerate the dangers to kind of bring them back to where I want them to be. And if I think that everybody is like paranoid, then I'm going to, exaggerate the safety in order. So I think, Plato had this idea of, true belief, right? If we get people to the right spot, it may be a product of combining their initial predispositions with some distortion on the other side. And I think William James was pretty insightful about this.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a great question that highlights the distinction between individual decision-making, wherein it's pretty clear that if you're trying to get people to make better decisions, you want them to believe the truth. Mm-hmm. You as an individual decision maker should want to believe the truth. You should want access to excellent information and good advice that helps you calibrate your judgment and make decisions that maximize expected value. But there is a profound challenge for leaders in how to calibrate their messages if they want to maximize appeal to an audience, if they want to maximize their credibility and the support they get from that audience, and if they're trying to do so in knowledge of the fact that their audience is diverse. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the example of communication around the coronavirus and protective measures that we might take. Undeniably, there are people who are not taking it seriously enough, and in meeting with too many others, in failing to wash their hands or wear masks as often as they should be, they're putting all the rest of us at risk. But if you're communicating with a diverse audience that includes paranoid germaphobes who have not left their homes since March, mm-hmm. and who've put on 30 pounds, like telling them to be more careful probably doesn't help them make better decisions. So I think there's some interesting challenges there for the exercise of leadership.
Yeah, and I think your book is really a call for calibration, and I think your belief is that there is, for any given task and for any given level of aptitude that you bring to the task, there is an optimal amount of confidence that you could have. I didn't realize that you'd done some work with Tony Robbins and you'd done the firewalk and all that sort of thing. Maybe before we jump into kind of the dangers of overconfidence, you could talk a little bit about underconfidence, because the American mentality is really all about the little engine that could, and you can do it, and William James was kind of the philosopher of fake it till you make it, right? And that's sort of what America is all about. Could you maybe talk about the dangers of underconfidence before we jump in and talk about overconfidence?
Sure.
I mean, I remember that we have at the business school, one of the first talks that the students get is from the dean, and it's I remember it was about imposter syndrome, right? And and part of what we do in the business school, we have a slogan, confidence without attitude, it's like we have these dials where we have to, we dial up the confidence, but then we smack it down, and then we dial it up and smack. And so talk about the dialing up part and why that might be valuable.
Yeah, you're right that the can-do spirit really captures a feature of the American ethos that William James articulated quite beautifully. So there's this passage in which he writes about the psychology of belief and imagines a circumstance in which he is faced with a physical challenge. He imagines he's on an alpine adventure, and he finds himself stuck at a point from which he must make a bold, dangerous leap across a chasm to move forward and to get down from the mountain where he's climbed. And he imagines two circumstances, one in which he embodies the courage to make it across. He believes in himself, and that allows him to jump farther. And that is juxtaposed with a circumstance in which he is impaired, sabotaged by self-doubt. He's not sure whether he can make it, but he goes for it anyway. And his caution leads him to fall short and fall into the crevasse. He concludes, in a circumstance like this, I would be a fool not to believe in myself, because the belief is the precondition for the successful achievement of that which I desire. In my book, I try to break down James's story a little bit, conceding the possibility that belief could enhance his ability to make it across. If we imagine that by believing in himself, it gives him the courage to jump an extra foot. And so if the doubting James could have made it 5 feet and the chasm is really 6 feet, he should believe in himself and go for it. But it does not follow from that always believing in yourself is better. If the chasm were 20 feet across, then believing in himself and going for it, however admirable it would display a faith in his own ability, if that meant jumping to his death, that doesn't seem like a wise strategy. So I think there's a lot to be said for good calibration. And you mentioned the orientation we give to our incoming MBA students. There's a real risk of the imposter syndrome. Anytime you find yourself undertaking some new challenge that really taxes your abilities, starting a new job or starting in a demanding graduate program, I think there's the real risk that people suffer the imposter syndrome. They think, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. And so some encouragement is of value. But you also know how much our faculty colleagues worry about students who think that they're masters of the universe and that the school owes them perfect grades, and that
we don't.
Moderating these students' confidence in themselves and making them a little bit less entitled might be better for the culture of the school and for their educational experience. So there were a couple of years when, at the encouragement of our faculty colleagues, I got up in new student orientation and noted, not all of you are going to make it to the C-suite. On average, you are average relative to your classmates, and you shouldn't all expect grades of A+.
Oh, wait, now if there were two lines, one for the comforting illusions and one for the honest truth, I think you, Don, probably wouldn't have too many people waiting in your line, would they? Would you?
And the student feedback to the orientation organizers was that I was too much of a downer. I have been withdrawn from week 0 and do not make that presentation anymore.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, I think a lot of people would argue that fortune rewards the brave. You know, it rewards the bold, and that there is some situations or evidence where a belief in success can increase the probability of success. I'm as an historian, I'm generally very skeptical whenever people say, kids today, this or whatever, and they look at short-term trends, and one of the reasons why I'm skeptical is because you can usually find evidence on both sides, and so a lot of people will say, today's young people are depressed at a higher rate and are confronted with suicidal thoughts and so forth at a higher rate. Of course, you got people on the other side that the youth of today are have egos that are too big, and so what is the evidence that belief in success can increase the probability of success? For whom might that message be valuable? Because there certainly are people that you described your father as someone who was very risk averse and afraid to even put money into the stock market and so forth. Could maybe he have used a little bit more of a William James like message?
Yeah. The idea that confidence enhances your probability of success is nowhere so much a part of an industry's culture as in entrepreneurship. So you hear from VCs to successful entrepreneurs to lots of others that if you want your entrepreneurial venture to be a success, you've got to believe in yourself. They have plenty of good examples to point to from successful entrepreneurs who displayed a delusional overconfidence in the prospects of their ventures. It is empirically the case. If you look at those who are persisting in starting their own firms and dedicating themselves to their success, that they are on average overconfident. So if you look at surveys of entrepreneurs, you will see that a substantial proportion of them think that success is highly likely or guaranteed, when in fact the statistics say that 80% of them are likely to be out of business within a few years.
So is this selection effect? I mean, probably if you look at all the people who are, homeless in the gutter, they might have been overconfident as well, right? Like I think Michael Rayner, I'm having Michael Rayner on interviewing him next week, and he made that point about businesses, right? Which is that, if you interview the people coming out of the casino with big smiles on their face, it's because they took the big risks. And if you look at all the people slinking out the back door, they're the ones that also took the big risks. So
right, yeah, okay. So that's a really important point. If you're a potential entrepreneur and your question is, what is the best strategy for me to pursue? What should I believe? Just because the most successful, the right tail of the distribution of success, is characterized by very high confidence, even excessive confidence, that doesn't mean that that's a positive expected value bet for you. You want to talk to all the people exiting the casino and understand how confident they were or whether they had accurate beliefs. Just because there are a few people who hit it big doesn't mean that fooling yourself into thinking that your venture will be successful and therefore maxing out your credit cards and convincing all your relatives to give you all their money and for them to take out second and third mortgages to fund your venture because you're so sure it's going to be successful, that is a good strategy. It's highly risky. Underlying your question is the issue of the degree to which confidence actually enhances success. And there are, of course, some circumstances in which it does. That if you have what it takes to win the race, and being confident enough to enter allows you to put your skills to use, then yes, you should be confident. You should believe in yourself. You should enter the race. On the other hand, the students in my class who are most sure they're going to ace the exam and who therefore don't study are not those who get the best grades. That believing in yourself doesn't necessarily enhance effort and performance. That there are circumstances in which performance depends on you investing the time and practice. And if being so sure that you've got it in the bag impairs your motivation to practice, then it can actually undermine your chance of success.
So I wonder if we're actually, holding up the right role models for, aspiring business people or whatever. I mean, if you have only successful people, and this is what we do. I mean, we have, successful people are the ones that speak on campus. They're the ones that, have the YouTube channels, they're the ones that actually, get on my podcast, right? They're the successful people. And if you ask people like, why are you successful? They're like, well, because, I worked hard and I persisted and I kept doing this. And so, but, we don't actually have people show up and speak in front of class who said, yeah, I worked my butt off and, I'm bankrupt, right? Like we don't invite them, right? Maybe we should, if we invited
getting people to listen to those shows.
Well, and the thing is, and if we invited them proportional, like, so if, you mentioned Free Solo, which is an amazing movie. I was just gosh, I mean, when you see that, or I forget the movie about, the guy who went across the World Trade Center, the Man on a Wire. it's those are the kinds of things that really make your whole, make you quiver with admiration for, humanity and so forth. And you see that. But in the Free Solo movie, there was an episode where on the very first time he did it, right, he turned away and said, "No, I'm not going to do this." Now, if the movie ended right there, right, like this guy made the right decision, because we don't actually know whether he would have died if he had gone that day. Suppose that, he would have died had he gone that day and he decided not to go. Like, no one's going to watch that movie, right?
Uh-huh.
But you need to have like probably 100 of those movies for every movie where he actually succeeds. So is it like, it's just that our probability, the way in which we're assessing probabilities, which is gleaned from the training data that we're presented with, through these examples, does that kind of, skew us towards overconfidence?
Yeah, the stories we pay attention to, the stories we find captivating and exciting and fun, and the movies we want to watch are not those about the 99 people who looked at El Cap and said, that's crazy. I'm not doing that. The one guy who does it, like, that's a great story that people want to watch. You mentioned Tony Robbins. And he, in the book, I tell the story of the Tony Robbins workshop I went to, the Unleash the Power Within weekend, where he culminates the first day with this fire walk. Robbins is someone who's particularly gifted at inspiring people to imagine their best selves, calling from them more energy and enthusiasm and commitment than they had previously thought possible. And he was great at firing up the crowd into a frenzy of passionate confidence and then sending us out to the firewalk. And in the book, I tell about how I got carried away and marched boldly across the burning embers, failing to take the protective measures that, in Robbins' defense, he had tried to drill into us. How at the end, you got to make sure to get those embers off of your feet and get them sprayed down with water. And as I suffered the painful consequences as a result, with some blisters on my feet that made the next few days quite painful.
So does he invite you to come in and do a little talk after his talk, like in Descartes and, Pierre Bayle,
talk
these
him
guys
down after he's gotten them worked up?
Well, in the old days, they would have like objections and replies, right? After your, manifesto, you would invite your opponents to come in and kind of poke holes in what you say. Do you ever, have you spoken on that circuit as a potential, mitigating speaker?
I have joined Robbins on the stage, but that was not my assignment at the time.
Okay.
I think it contributes to wiser decision-making. It's not such good theater.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you referred to overconfidence as kind of a gateway bias. I've always thought of kind of confirmation bias as like the gateway bias, the bias that makes all the other biases possible. But in your book, you also you kind of show how they're very closely related, and how the confirmation bias, which is essentially what's reinforcing this overconfidence bias. Could you talk a little bit about how do those things kind of work together?
Sure. Yeah. So I talk about overconfidence as the mother of all biases, because to the extent it makes us too certain that we're right, too confident in the accuracy of our imperfect intuitive judgment, it impairs our interest in correction, or in considering the possibility that we might be wrong. If we think about it in a Bayesian framework, one way that a lot of economists have modeled overconfidence is too tight a prior. That is, we're too sure that our noisy private signal is accurate and underestimate the error and noise that's built into it as a product of our idiosyncratic history or excessive faith in our intuitive judgment. You can think of confirmation bias as underweighting the informational value and evidence that we encounter. Like, we're too willing to confirm our priors and therefore neglect informative, disconfirming evidence that might suggest we should doubt ourselves. And in either case, the result is that you update too little to evidence that suggests you might be wrong or that your beliefs merit revision.
Yeah, when I teach in behavioral finance, and I've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of what you're discussing comes up in that class. But in that class, we talk about kind of individual decision making, but then we also talk about collective decision making. And JDM is really, in many ways, about individual decision making, and then org design is really about kind of collective decision making. And so, when I teach pricing and I talk about, there's all these biases that go into pricing. This, but when it comes to B2B pricing, you don't have to worry about all that stuff. And I'm like, well, actually, that's not true because organizations behave, right? I mean, an individual is a collection of cells and a collection of modules and impulses, and they're all competing against each other. And you are essentially like an integration function across all these different objectives. And an organization is acting as an agent that's integrating all of these kind of objective functions as well. And so I always think that there ought to be a field called organizational behavioral economics, right? To really study the irrationalities of organizations. And I think when you talked about, the financial crisis, which is, I think, a great example of organizations that were really overconfident. And it's not simply a matter of take a bunch of overconfident people and staple them together, right? How because you can have non-overconfident people, staple them together and get an overconfident organization. You could get a bunch of overconfident people, staple them together and get a well regulated, calibrated organization if they have the right processes. So on the one hand, like how can individuals calibrate themselves, and then how can organizations calibrate themselves? And do you need a different set of tools to do those things?
Great question. Oh, man. So, when the individuals are overconfident, they will attend too little to the advice or input from others. So there's a lot of research in JDM on advice taking, which basically shows people tend to underweight advice from others. One of the ways that this plays out in markets and organizations is that people are too willing to act on their own beliefs and private information, too sure that they're right. So that can contribute to a willingness to trade in markets against sophisticated others who have lots of information. Like, you proceed as if those other people are clueless morons who are just wrong about their valuation of the equity that you're trading. And so you can confidently proceed on your own subjective impression and trade against them. That's obviously hazardous. In organizations, it's too often, it occurs too often that people sort of neglect the perceptions or opinions of others. We neglect advice from people who disagree with us, taking disagreement as a challenge to our egos or an opportunity to try to argue against, persuade, or politically defeat those who have different perspectives. In fact, that disagreement is often an opportunity of tremendous value. You want to understand others and where they're coming. So what is it? What facts do you know that I don't that lead you to believe something so different from me? And successful organizations, from Bridgewater Associates to Amazon to Netflix, find ways to build into their culture an ethos of respectful disagreement that allows people to hear each other, understand others' perspectives, learn things that they hadn't already known, and use that information to update their beliefs and make wiser decisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that needs to be an integral part of the educational process from very early age. Because you might not be so lucky as to find yourself in a culture like that, and you need to hone that skill even if you're a solo practitioner. But I want to dive into that. But before we get to that, you were mentioning this idea of as an investor, you've got your private signal, and then you've got the kind of public signal or, the signal of others, and you tend to overweight your private signal. But the flip side of that, or the boundary condition of that, is when we study things like bubbles. There, it's really more the opposite, right? So there, it's really more about contagion and about how you might look at Tesla and say, well, can it really be worth $800 a share? Well, everybody else seems to think so. So I'm just going to abandon my DCF analysis, and I'm going to abandon, my everything that seems obvious to me, because I must be the idiot in the room. Right. So there's situations where the private signals actually get wiped out. And I wrote an article like 20 years ago about how, overconfidence may actually be a necessary prerequisite for price discovery, because you need people to, inject their opinion into that wisdom of the crowd, in spite of the fact that their opinion differs from what they perceive the crowd to be thinking. So how do we get that weighting scheme right? Not only from an individual perspective, but I think there's also kind of the social welfare. Another example of this is, in lawsuits, right? Most plaintiffs are irrational, right? In the sense that their likelihood of winning, if you look at all the great Supreme Court cases that overturned precedent, they really came about because somebody was profoundly overconfident in their likelihood of winning, and this is what kind of holds people accountable, because it's a private cost to you. So you're either extremely, other oriented and altruistic, or you just are overconfident, and the overconfidence can play the same role as altruism in that case.
Yeah. So in those cases, as in the cases of entrepreneurs who are ultimately successful, I think it's possible to regard what those people do as serving a public good. Mm-hmm. That as a nation, our economy benefits tremendously, and perhaps no state more than our home state of California, from the passion and commitment of entrepreneurs who have developed so many great ideas, contributed so much to technological advancement and to economic growth. I am profoundly grateful to those people for what they've achieved. It has contributed enormously to economic growth and to quality of life. I'm also grateful to those who go around my neighborhood picking up trash, or who contribute more than they need to in taxes. That is a sacrifice that people make on behalf of the public that isn't necessarily a strategy for maximizing individual welfare. And so to note the benefits, the public benefits of some circumstances in which overconfidence can lead to persistence in excess of what expected value calculations might justify, doesn't then imply everyone should be overconfident. We can be grateful to those who make sacrifices at their own expense without wanting to follow suit.
Right. So when it comes to kind of org design or market design, it's about how do you harness that energy. When I was talking to Barry, at a previous podcast, he was talking about how, well, look, when you're hiring people, hire them for the things that you can't teach them, and then teach them the things that you can teach them. And so if we think that most people, or a lot of people, are overconfident, as an organization, does it make sense to try to diffuse their overconfidence, or would it be an easier strategy to kind of design a system where those things can offset one another? And I like to think if you have an overly optimistic CEO and an overly pessimistic CFO, and then you staple them together, the boat might actually go straight. You know what I mean? And that maybe. Is that easier? is that easier or harder than trying to sit them both down and say, hey, let's do a calibration exercise here with both of you and turn you into rational people?
I think I'd be more willing to bet on the latter than the former. That is, combining two biases and hoping that they balance each other out seems more problematic and more fraught with risk than trying to figure out a way to maximize expected value, to empower an individual to think about the reasons for and against, to think about the costs and the benefits, to think about the risks and the opportunities, and to have in one mind the information come together and balance itself in a way that might allow for decisions that maximize expected value, rather than putting warring factions against each other and hope that somehow the truth emerges from the conflict. It seems like a bad bet to me.
But that also seems like the approach that, Adam Smith and Alexander Hamilton and all the rest have taken, which is, human nature is kind of a difficult thing to change. But of course, that would mean our jobs are kind of superfluous as teachers, right? It's kind of a grim view of the malleability of humans. But you've given some examples of how.
So can I respond to that? I have a thought. So you noted the inherent tensions in trying to apply a prescriptive economic lens to fraught human endeavor. That it requires acknowledging the truth that we're imperfect, that our intuitions do not match the perfect economic rationality, that we will make mistakes, that we have finite cognitive processing capacity, that we will be swayed by compelling speakers and confident contenders for leadership, that will, for all our good intentions, fail to measure up to the economic ideal. Admitting that doesn't recommend then that we give in to our worst impulses and just sort of accept failure. It underscores the value, as you highlight, for the role of a teacher or a guide that encourages us to do better. Acknowledging that we will never attain perfection doesn't suggest that we abandon it. It just underscores the importance of that pursuit and figuring out ways to better come close to the ideal that we all aspire to.
Yeah, and I guess you've been an advocate of, hey, we can actually, through education, both at say university level and in the employment context, we can actually improve people's judgment. We can improve their decision making, improve their estimation. And I'm going to want you to talk about the judgment project, that you did with Phil Tetlock and Barbara Mellers, and I want to talk about that in a second. But it seems to me that like, if you want people to learn to be questioners, if you want people to learn to be feedback generators and feedback recipients, in the ideal world and an ideal organization, that might be a way of advancing. But in a lot of organizations, that's kind of like career suicide. I feel like if I tell my students, if it ain't broke, fix it anyway. But and question the status quo, which is the motto of at Berkeley Haas. I feel like sometimes if we teach people to question the status quo, we're sending them on a suicide mission for a lot of organizations, because that's not what a lot of employers want. And I mean, I even had a senior administrator say that that's code word for being a jerk. So how do we does being someone who is this questioner and this person making good decisions and well calibrated, do they need to have a habitat that is compatible with that way of doing things? In other words, can being overconfident and being someone resistant to feedback, can that actually be an advantage in certain environments? And could that explain its prevalence?
It's a good question, and one that I have confronted in the context of another one of Haas's defining principles, and that is confidence without attitude. We want our graduates to be confident in their abilities, but not come off as arrogant jerks. That defining principle sort of sits next to the concern that in graduating dolphins to swim happily and peacefully in the corporate oceans,
with a lot of sharks.
That if they're competing with rivals from other schools that are better at generating sharks, that they're going to get eaten. And there certainly are some workplaces that reward aggressive shark-like behavior to their detriment. And here it's easy to think of places like Enron, whose culture of rewarding star performers disproportionately, promoting the conquering hero, even when that meant neglecting the team that had made their success possible. That sort of culture has often proved itself destructive. In highlighting the value of the cooperative, supportive, honest, and self-critical culture that that Haas is better at promoting, it's easy for me to identify workplaces and organizations. I mentioned already Amazon and Netflix that try to balance courage with caution and make wise decisions, acknowledging the reality that nobody achieves success on their own, and that what you want is a workplace culture that maximizes the performance of everybody there. You can argue that what we're doing is actually good for our students and for the organizations that they're going into, which is not to say that they'll always be loved and appreciated for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we believe that most organizations are trending in that direction, then we're preparing them for where they're ultimately going to work. And if we believe that the other organizations are going to essentially go bankrupt, which I do believe that organizations that don't promote a culture of continuous feedback will sooner or later die on the vine. But
you and I both know that just because markets are competitive doesn't mean they're perfectly efficient, and that plenty of organizations persist and succeed despite having dysfunctional cultures.
Yeah, disequilibrium can last a long time, I've discovered.
The markets can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent.
Yes, or alive. But as someone who used to teach evolutionary biology back in the day, I'm always trying to find, just those stories that can explain the things, why they persist. And if we think about overconfidence, it's been my experience, like in the financial world, that the customer-facing people, and if you're trying to climb the corporate ladder, you are customer-facing, where your manager is your customer. Customer-facing folks tend to be rewarded for exhibiting overconfident tendencies, and so I'm wondering, is this? You could come up with a clever signaling model that would say that this is signaling some underlying characteristic, and in the same way that getting a degree does, and so it could that be a story, or is this just? The alternative is that, again, it's just silly irrationality. And you mentioned a couple of my favorite examples where if you wear platform shoes, even if you tell people you're wearing platform shoes, people still think you're taller, right? And if you give someone a higher grade, even if you tell everybody that the grade is inflated, people still think you're smarter. Is it just that, like, what's the evolutionary story behind the success of customer-facing, overconfident folks? So salespeople, doctors, lawyers, contractors. I've never met a contractor when I asked for an estimate that gave me an accurate estimate. We'll get into confidence intervals in a second, but what could possibly be the evolutionary story here?
Yeah. Okay. Good question. There are evolutionary models that ask questions like the one you've just posed and that identify a potentially evolutionary successful strategy for overconfidence. There was one not too long ago that got published in the journal Nature by Johnson and Fowler that noted that in contests between conspecifics for access to limited resources such as mates or food, when two individuals meet, if there's a possibility they'll fight, there will be one winner and one loser, and the fight will be costly. They would prefer to avoid that fight if they can identify who would win it. Then the loser would just concede and not suffer the injuries.
So like an agonistic display, right? You have a
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And in that agonistic display, there's some incentive to exaggerate your strength if it means you can scare off stronger rivals some percent of the time. And so you can build a model that in some circumstances, depending on some of its assumptions, can allow an evolutionarily stable strategy of overconfidence in which you exaggerate your strength in those sorts of encounters. The public-facing role you identify, right? So,
but that's more of that's a competitive situation. What about like in an agency relationship, right? So, because that's where I think we see a lot of it, where, if we talk about leadership, if Winston Churchill got up there and said, there's a 40% chance that we'll be able to beat back the Nazis, right? I mean, like no one's gonna die on a beach for that, right? I mean,
I'm not so sure. So you can be Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill did say this. He said, our success is not guaranteed. We have months of miserable struggle ahead of us. We will suffer. Our young men will die on the battlefield. The cost will be colossal. But my fellow citizens, it is worth the fight because giving in is unconscionable. We cannot accept defeat by this fascist imperialist foe. We must resist with every fiber of our being. So you can call people to undertake a challenging task whose success is not guaranteed. And that is a rhetorical and leadership challenge, of course, in a circumstance like that calls for Herculean effort in the face of an enormous challenge. But there's a question implicit in what you said about the degree to which you need to fool yourself or others about the prospects of success. Again, I think there's the risk that if you actually succeed in fooling your company or your country, that success is guaranteed. If you lead them to think, we got this one in the bag, for sure, those Nazis, they're toast. Like, you may fail to exhibit the effort that is required to succeed, that honestly conveying the challenges ahead and the sort of effort and commitment that is called for may facilitate the success that you seek. And that raises a question that Bill von Hippel and Robert Trivers explore in their research, building on this evolutionary model that I described, where they pose the question of whether it is better to fool yourself. If fooling yourself helps you fool others, then maybe. But I think the evidence for that is not great. That fooling yourself can actually lull yourself into excessive comfort, right? You could become the hare in the race between the tortoise and the hare, where you wind up losing because you're too sure of yourself. And in fact, wise individual decision-making and often wise group decision-making is facilitated by honest confrontation of the challenges you face and your prospects for success.
So in your book, you distinguish between overestimation, overplacement, overprecision. I think most people don't even realize that there are these different ways of being overconfident. And I think the biggest impact that you've had on me in all my years of teaching is that I simply refuse to accept a point estimate from anyone about anything. Right? And if someone
Good
says,
man.
"Hey, I'll meet you at the restaurant at 8:00," I'm like, "Yeah, well, what's the 90% confidence interval on that?" Right? And people, they look at me like I'm insane. But I think this is something which is super super helpful. And so you've come up with a couple ways of helping people to come up with better forecasts and better estimates. And you've worked with companies to help put this in place. And I think you highlighted how even organizations like the IMF and when they come up with growth estimates, they don't do confidence intervals. Like, what is going on? How do you get people to use some of these techniques? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the Judgment Project with your colleagues.
Yeah, the Good Judgement Project was an effort I undertook with a large team of colleagues and collaborators. But you mentioned Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers, who were with me, principal investigators on the project. And the story of that project is told quite entertainingly in Phil Tetlock's book with Dan Gardner, Super Forecasting. We accepted a challenge from IARPA, the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity, to take part in a forecasting tournament where they fed us questions of interest to the U.S. intelligence community, questions about geopolitical events, such as whether Greece would default on its sovereign debt, or whether there would be a deadly conflict in the South China Sea, or any number of related questions on which the U.S. intelligence community and the diplomatic community and the State Department were interested in accurate, honest forecasts. We put these questions to the forecasters who are on our team. And if I can brag for a moment, our team did better than the other 4 teams in the tournament with whom we were competing. And the story of our success is mostly a story about the wisdom of the crowd on which we relied. We were fortunate to recruit a number of hardworking, dedicated, thoughtful, and self-critical individuals. These weren't experts in their fields, but they were educated readers of the New York Times, people who were well informed of the issues of the day and willing to do hard work researching the specific questions about, the Egyptian revolution and what was going on in Tahrir Square, signing on to Egyptian Twitter and getting translated messages in Egyptian about what was going on in the front lines of that Egyptian revolution, to help them update their beliefs about the degree, the staying power of Egyptian leaders, or how that event would unfold. And what's striking about their efforts is the degree to which they were willing to be self-critical and think probabilistically about the events in question. So often, as you note, we look to others to provide certain predictions. When are you going to show up? I'll be there at 8 p.m. Who's going to win? The Bulls are going to win the game. Who's going to win the election? Biden's going to win the election. Well, the truth is, it is fantastically uncertain, fantastically rare for us to know the future with certainty. That in forecasts of election outcomes and in forecasts of the weather, the best we can do is a probability. And being willing to think probabilistically about the future and admit the uncertainty that we've got. Biden had a pretty good chance of winning the election, but it wasn't certain. Hillary Clinton also had a pretty good chance of winning the election, and that one came out with a surprising outcome. Confessing our uncertainty about the future helps get us out of this trap of pretending to be confident where it's not merited. And a lot of unsophisticated, observers of political forecasts took sophisticated forecasters like Nate Silver to task for having given Hillary Clinton a 71% chance ahead of the 2016 election. And Silver's sensible rejoinder was, I didn't say 100%. I said 71%. 29% of the time, something with 29% chance is going to happen. And I gave Trump 29% chance. Sometimes that'll happen.
Yeah. So, and this kind of raises the issue of I think diversity and also of kind of generalism versus specialization. And, you've talked about how, collective decision making, individual decision making benefits from having exposure to alternative viewpoints. And collective decision making is optimized when you have these diverse viewpoints. Now, I think, diversity is a buzzword that we all talk about. I think sometimes people misunderstand what is meant by this, right? Which is, really bringing different things to the table that are relevant for the decision. And it also, I think your discovery was that sometimes good generalists can sometimes collectively do better than a group of exclusively specialists. And I tell my MBA students that the purpose of an MBA is really, and I'm a big fan of the degree, even though it's under a lot of criticism. I'm a big fan of the idea that, we're creating PhDs in common sense, right? The goal is to create like the best generalists out there who know how to harness expertise. Just like you don't need to memorize the map of London now as a cab driver, because you got Google Maps. We've got statisticians, we've got epidemiologists, we've got all these other folks. We can lean on them. But you have to, because as a generalist, you know that you can go and look for different types of specialists and staple their viewpoints together. So I want to know if you could talk about that. And then also, the idea of diversity and whether this notion is under threat a little bit. I've been very frustrated by the coronavirus discussion, because I feel like the science has the idea of different perspectives and viewpoints, all of which are within this scientific mainstream, get filtered out because of politics and so forth. How can we maintain this rich notion of diversity to promote discovery? Does it require an optimal mix of generalists and specialists?
Boy, it's a great question. So there's quite a bit of work in JDM and in psychology on the wisdom of the crowd. And the very idea is built into the way that markets operate. So one of the reasons why the stock market is as efficient as it is that those sorts of markets are efficient aggregators of disparate information held by all sorts of market participants. And that diversity is absolutely essential to the market's efficiency and its successful operation. In too many organizational settings, you wind up, thanks to the hierarchical structure of an organization, deferring to the hippo, the highest paid person in the organization. And as soon as the boss articulates an opinion, everybody genuflects to that position, and you lose the diversity that makes the crowd wise. What are the alternatives? There are some great alternatives, including trying to extract information from the crowd before the boss weighs in with his or her opinion. So one simple way to do that is before a meeting where you have to come to some important decision, you force everybody to vote, to pre-commit, or to identify their preferred list of candidates or outcome options or whatever it is that you're talking about. And only once you've elicited the crowd's wisdom, then you open up the discussion. Maybe you begin the meeting by saying, here are the options that came out in order. The top ranked option was this one. Let's talk about that one.
So it's like the Alfred Sloan idea that you need to force disagreement.
Yeah, I love that story where his board was in unanimous agreement on something. And he said, gentlemen, let's adjourn for a while and inform ourselves of what this decision is really about. As in, we need some diverse perspectives here. It's scaring me if everybody agrees. It suggests we haven't really thought about this enough.
Yeah, I tell my students, if all your friends agree with you, you need new friends. And if all your friends like you need new friends. You need a couple that don't like you and don't agree with you.
Yeah, our rivals, our enemies, and our critics are providing gifts of inestimable value. What do they know that leads to that differing perspective? And it's not necessarily the case that you should always wind up agreeing. Annie Duke, in her book Thinking in Bets, identifies a wonderful way to capitalize on disagreement, where you got someone who's arguing against you. Instead of like trying to persuade them of your perspective, don't fight about your disagreement, bet on it. So inviting them want to bet allows you to make a profitable opportunity of this information discrepancy. And if they're being irrational, then you stand to make money on the disagreement that you're talking about. But you want to make sure in that process that there's useful information discovery, that you learn from them what it is that they're paying attention to. You bet against them only if you remain pretty sure that you have information that they're not taking into account. And of course, that's possible. Not everyone's perfectly rational.
Well, so you mentioned the devil's advocate, right, in the Vatican, and can you simulate this? I as in law school, we would just tell people, okay, this is the argument you're going to make. You don't have a choice in the matter. We don't ask you what you think. We say this is what you and I think in other disciplines that's a little less common. Certainly in business school, I have a difficult time getting people to take certain sides of certain arguments because people are very concerned about how they're going to appear. And so even when they do it, they preface it by saying, "Now, look, I don't really believe this." I say, "All right, you've already lost. You've already lost. Like that's not. I didn't ask you to do that, right?" So the idea of role playing and a perspective taking seems to be a very important skill to help get closer to a more accurate view of the world.
Yeah. I agree. It can be a political challenge. There are companies that try to appoint people to the role of devil's advocate to speak against some initiative. And you usually want the person who is in that position to be politically secure, a trusted ally or consigliere to the boss, if not the boss, him or herself being the one to articulate the con position. So it's not a recipe for making everybody get along better or feel good, because the devil's advocate position, if fulfilled, really means raising doubts and questioning the wisdom of the group's approach, highlighting the possibility of failure. So that can bring up dissent and make people doubt whether success is assured, but it is enormously helpful for making better decisions.
Yeah, in some versions of King Lear, the jester is killed by King Lear and strangled by him, and it's that's always a disturbing moment.
It takes a courageous leader to be able to make full use of that valuable information, and there are plenty of leaders with fragile egos. We've seen one in the White House for the last 4 years who resist the critical input of devil's advocates.
Yeah, and it was certainly in the financial crisis where the chief risk officer was, progressively made less and less senior in a lot of these organizations. Right? They're like, "You're not a team player," and so they would kind of demote them and give them less oversight. I guess there's one last thing that I found fascinating in the book, which was you described this story of Jeff Rubin, who was an expert in kind of escalation of commitment and as an expert wound up actually dying of a failure to recognize the behavior that he specialized in. Is this an example of the cobbler and the shoes, right? An expert failing to recognize the phenomenon that they study. It's something I always worry about, right? Because we the more we study something, the more we have to worry that we ourselves are failing to exhibit the things that we know so well.
Yeah. Jeff Rubin's story is such a painful one. So he studied escalation of commitment and was also an avid mountain climber. He set himself the goal of climbing all the top 100 peaks in the Northeast U.S., and he'd come so close to achieving his goal. He'd climbed the top 99 and was on the last, Mount Katahdin. He set out on a day where the weather wasn't ideal, and his fellow climber at one point said, "This is unsafe, we should turn back." And Rubin said, "I'm going for it. It represents the achievement of my goal. If you're not comfortable, you should head back by yourself." His partner did, and Rubin persisted. In doing so, he displayed courage and grit, and he died on that mountain. Mm-hmm. Climbers are vulnerable to what they call summit fever, where the commitment to making the summit overwhelms all your better judgment, and you soldier on courageously despite the risks. It's what happened in the fateful expedition on Mount Everest, where so many died. They had set a limit beforehand. Mm-hmm. If they weren't on the summit by 2 p.m., they were going to turn back regardless of how close they were. They didn't abide by their own rule. When the summit was in view at 2 p.m., those who were still trying, they had sacrificed so much to get there. They wound up sacrificing a whole lot more. Many of them died on the mountain that day. And that story highlights a way out of the predicament. If you anticipate the possibility you could get summit fever, that you could wind up acting against your own self-interest, getting carried away with the lure of success of your venture or your project, set yourself some limit, some stopping point that will force you to confront the risks ahead and the wisdom of de-escalating your commitment and turning around before you die, before you lose it all in the venture.
Yeah, this is, think of it as optimal stopping rules, right? And thinking them through ahead of time. I just listened to a podcast with Steve Levitt. He was talking about quitting and how quitting is a good thing, and certainly when it comes to we look at venture capitalists, right? Venture capitalists and entrepreneurs they're the ones that are going to power through no matter what, and the venture capitalists are the ones whose job it is to pull the plug, right? And and the reason why venture capitalists are the ones that are successful are the ones that are best at pulling the plug. And the ones that aren't successful are the ones that carry on, for too long.
Throwing good money after bad. Yeah.
And so, understanding how those things balance each other out is super important. Don, look, there's so much we could talk about. We could go on for days, I think. But we got to wrap it up. So, thanks so much for coming in and talking today. We really appreciate it. Every time I talk to you, there's always, I think, some new light bulbs that go off in my head, and I think that your work is ideal for this unsiloed format.
Thanks, Greg. This is really fun.
And so everybody out there, check out this book, Perfectly Confident. Awesome book. I'm 100% confident you're going to like it.
This is Unsiloed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.